Abbey Road Studios, November 23, 1964. The red recording light glowed like a warning as George Martin pressed stop on the 4-track machine. The Beatles had been struggling for 3 hours with the same song, and the producer's patience was wearing thin. John Lennon slumped against his Rickenbacker. Paul McCartney rubbed his temples. George Harrison stared at his fingernails, and Ringo Dalton tapped a nervous rhythm on his snare rim. What none of them knew was that in exactly 20 minutes, a peculiar man with a ukulele would walk through Studio 2's doors and change the trajectory of popular music forever. But first, George Martin had to make the most controversial suggestion of his career. The song they'd been working on was "I Should Have Known Better," and it was sounding exactly like everything else they'd recorded. Catchy, yes. Revolutionary, no. Martin had heard that same 3-chord progression from dozens of Liverpool bands. The Beatles were becoming victims of their own success, trapped in a formula that was making them rich but wasn't pushing boundaries. Martin knew they were capable of more. He'd seen flashes of brilliance in their songwriting, moments where they transcended the Mersey beat and touched something universal. But those moments were becoming rarer. "Gentlemen," Martin said through the studio intercom, his crisp BBC accent cutting through the tension, "we need to talk." He emerged from the control booth straightening his tie in that particular way he did when he was about to say something the band wouldn't like. The Beatles looked up at him with varying degrees of exhaustion and irritation. John's expression was particularly sour, his teddy boy sneer more pronounced than usual. "This isn't working," Martin continued. "You're repeating yourselves. The magic that made Love Me Do special. It's gone sterile." John bristled immediately. "Sterile? George, we've had more number ones this year than anyone in British history. The fans are going mad for this sound." His voice carried that Liverpool edge that appeared whenever he felt criticized. Paul, ever the diplomat, tried to smooth things over. "What exactly are you suggesting, George?" Martin paused, knowing what he was about to propose would sound absurd. "I think we need to bring in someone from outside. Someone who can show you a different approach to melody, to vocal delivery. Someone who isn't trapped in the current sound." Ringo spoke up from behind his kit. "Like who? Sinatra?" Martin took a breath. "Actually, I was thinking of a chap called Tiny Tim. Herbert Carey. He's an American musician who specializes in vintage songs from the 1890s through the 1920s. Plays ukulele, has an extraordinary vocal range. The silence that followed was deafening. George Harrison was the first to break it. 'You want to bring a ukulele player into Abbey Road, to work with us?' John's laugh was harsh. "Have you lost your mind, George? We're the Beatles. We don't need some novelty act teaching us about music." But Martin wasn't finished. "This man knows more about American popular song than anyone I've ever met. He's a walking encyclopedia of pre-war music. The techniques he uses, the emotional delivery, it's authentic in a way that we've lost. I think he could show you something about connecting with a song that goes beyond just getting it right." Paul leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Where did you hear about him?" Martin smiled slightly. "He's been performing at small clubs in Greenwich Village. Brian Epstein mentioned him after his last trip to New York. Said the man was extraordinary, completely unique." John was shaking his head. "This is mental. We're here to record Beatles songs, not take lessons from some American throwback." That's when the studio door opened. Brian Epstein entered, followed by the most unusual figure any of them had ever seen. Tiny Tim stood 6 feet tall, but seemed somehow delicate, almost ethereal. His long dark hair hung in gentle waves past his shoulders. He wore a worn brown suit that might have been fashionable in 1935, carried a battered ukulele case, and moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to navigate a world that didn't understand him. His eyes, large and kind, swept the room with genuine wonder. "Oh my," he said in that distinctive voice, somewhere between a whisper and a song, "the actual Beatles. God bless you all." John's sneer deepened. "And you are?" Tiny Tim set down his ukulele case with reverence and bowed slightly. "Herbert Carey, though most people call me Tiny Tim. Mr. Epstein was kind enough to suggest I might be of some small assistance." His voice had a quality that was impossible to ignore, formal and old-fashioned but completely sincere. Paul found himself studying the man's face, trying to understand what he was seeing. There was something ageless about Tiny Tim, as if he might have stepped out of a daguerreotype. "What kind of assistance?" Paul asked. Tiny Tim's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Well, Mr. Martin mentioned you might enjoy exploring some of the older musical traditions. The songs from before the Great War, when melody was king and every note carried the full weight of human emotion. George Harrison, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "You actually know songs from that era? Original arrangements?" Tiny Tim nodded eagerly. "Oh yes, Mr. Harrison. I have over 3,000 songs memorized, from 1890 to 1935. Everything from barbershop quartets to early jazz, from music hall numbers to the first recorded blues. I study the original recordings, you see. 78 RPM records, Edison cylinders. I've spent years in the music archives at the New York Public Library, learning how these songs were meant to sound." John rolled his eyes. "Fascinating. And this helps us how exactly?" But something in Tiny Tim's passion was beginning to penetrate even John's cynicism. "Perhaps," Tiny Tim said with gentle deference, "I could demonstrate? Would that be acceptable?" He looked around the room as if asking permission to breathe. Martin nodded. "Please, we'd love to hear something." Tiny Tim opened his case with the careful attention of someone handling a religious artifact. His ukulele was old, the wood worn smooth by decades of playing. He tuned it quickly but thoroughly, his ear clearly trained to perfect pitch. "This is a song from 1920, he said. "It was written by a gentleman named Al Dubin. The melody teaches us something important about hope." He positioned the ukulele and began to play. What came out was unlike anything they'd ever heard in Abbey Road. Tiny Tim's voice soared into that impossible falsetto, but it wasn't a gimmick. It was angelic, otherworldly, carrying the melody with such pure intention that the studio seemed to transform around them. The song was Tiptoe Through the Tulips, but the way he performed it was revelation. Every note was deliberate. Every pause carried meaning. His voice danced between the ukulele strings, creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible with such simple instrumentation. The Beatles stood transfixed. This wasn't just music. This was music stripped down to its essential elements, melody and emotion, nothing else. When the song ended, the silence in Studio 2 was different from before. It wasn't the silence of frustration or confusion. It was the silence of people who had just witnessed something they didn't have words for. John's sneer had completely disappeared. Paul was staring at Tiny Tim as if seeing him for the first time. George had unconsciously picked up his guitar. Ringo was nodding slightly, his drummer's instincts recognizing something profound in Tiny Tim's rhythm. "Bloody hell," John finally whispered. "How did you do that?" Tiny Tim smiled with childlike pleasure. "Oh, it's not difficult, Mr. Lennon. It's simply about serving the song rather than forcing the song to serve you." Paul stepped forward. "That approach to melody, the way you move between notes, I've never heard anything like it." Tiny Tim's eyes sparkled. "Ah, Mr. McCartney, you have such a natural gift for melody already. But what if I showed you some techniques from the 1920s, ways of approaching a song that might open new possibilities?" George Martin was watching all of this with growing amazement. He had hoped Tiny Tim might provide some inspiration, but what was happening exceeded his wildest expectations. The Beatles, who moments ago had been dismissive and tired, were suddenly engaged in a way he'd rarely seen. They were curious, hungry to learn. "Show us," George Harrison said quietly. What followed was unlike any recording session in Abbey Road history. Tiny Tim began explaining melodic techniques that had been lost for decades. He demonstrated how early crooners used breath control to create emotional intensity. He showed them rhythm patterns from ragtime that could be adapted to rock arrangements. Most importantly, he demonstrated how to find the emotional core of a song and build everything else around that truth. "You see," Tiny Tim said, his voice taking on an almost professorial quality, "in the old days a singer had only one chance. No multiple takes, no overdubs. Everything had to be perfect because the wax cylinder could only capture what happened in that moment. So singers learned to mean every word." John, who had been listening intently, suddenly picked up his guitar. "Play that melody again. The one from the chorus." Tiny Tim obliged, his ukulele dancing through the tune. John began finding chord progressions that supported the melody in ways that enhanced rather than competed with Tiny Tim's vocal line. Paul joined in on bass, creating a foundation that lifted rather than anchored the song. George added delicate guitar fingerpicking that wove around the ukulele like musical lace. Ringo kept time with brushes instead of sticks, creating texture rather than force. What emerged was magical. "This is it," Paul said suddenly. "This is what we've been missing. We've been so focused on being louder, being bigger, being more exciting. But we've forgotten about beauty." Tiny Tim nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yes, Mr. McCartney, beauty is the secret. When you create something beautiful, truly beautiful, people feel it in their hearts. Not just their minds, not just their bodies, their hearts." George Martin was recording everything. knowing that what he was capturing would be impossible to recreate. The sound coming through the studio monitors was unlike anything in popular music. It combined the Beatles' natural energy with Tiny Tim's ethereal sensibility, creating something that belonged to neither the 1920s nor the 1960s, but to music itself. As the afternoon progressed, something extraordinary happened. The Beatles began teaching Tiny Tim about electric instruments, while he taught them about musical authenticity. John showed him how distortion could create emotional texture. Paul demonstrated how bass lines could carry melody. George explained how guitar effects could enhance rather than mask the core song. Ringo played rhythms that combined swing with rock, creating new possibilities for both genres. And Tiny Tim absorbed it all with the wonder of someone discovering a new language. "You gentlemen are creating the future," he said with genuine awe. "But you're building it on the foundation of the past. That's what makes it so powerful." The breakthrough came when they began working on Yesterday. Paul had written the basic melody, but something about it wasn't connecting. It felt too simple, too obvious. Tiny Tim listened to Paul play it once, then nodded thoughtfully. "It's a beautiful melody, Mr. McCartney, but I think you're approaching it from the wrong direction. May I suggest something?" Paul gestured for him to continue. "In the old days, we would start with the emotion and let the melody grow from that feeling. What emotion are you trying to convey?" Paul thought for a moment. "Loss, regret, the feeling that something precious has slipped away." Tiny Tim nodded. "Ah yes, the melancholy of time. I know this feeling well." He began to play, but not Yesterday. Instead, he played a song from 1923 called My Blue Heaven. But the way he performed it transformed the familiar tune into something heartbreaking. His voice carried such longing that the studio seemed to ache. The melody bent and curved around the emotion, serving it rather than dictating it. When he finished, Paul was staring at him with tears in his eyes. "That's it," Paul whispered. "That's what the song needs to feel like." He picked up his guitar and began playing Yesterday again, but now he approached it the way Tiny Tim had approached My Blue Heaven. The melody became a living thing, breathing with the emotion rather than simply carrying it. John, watching this transformation, felt something shift in his own understanding of songwriting. He had always been more interested in clever lyrics than beautiful melodies, but seeing Paul's breakthrough made him realize the two didn't have to be separate. "Tiny Tim," he said suddenly, "how do you handle anger in this style? All the songs you've shown us are about love or loss. What about rebellion?" Tiny Tim considered this seriously. "Well, Mr. Lennon, anger was expressed differently in those days, less direct perhaps, but no less powerful. May I demonstrate?" He began to play a song that the Beatles had never heard, something from the early 1900s. But in his interpretation, the seemingly innocent lyrics became a scathing social commentary, the sweet melody making the criticism even more pointed. John's eyes widened as he understood what Tiny Tim was showing him: subversion through beauty, revolution through melody. "That's brilliant," John said. "You can say anything if you wrap it in the right package." Tiny Tim smiled. "Oh yes, Mr. Lennon. The old songwriters knew this secret. They could criticize kings and presidents as long as they did it beautifully." John immediately began applying this concept to his own writing, finding ways to embed his natural wit and social observation into melodies that enhanced rather than competed with his message. The session was becoming a master class in songwriting, with Tiny Tim as the unlikely teacher and the Beatles as eager students. George Harrison, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "Tiny Tim, I've been working on something that I can't quite figure out. It's about spirituality, but I don't want it to sound preachy. Do you know any songs that deal with spiritual themes?" Tiny Tim's face lit up with understanding. "Oh, Mr. Harrison, spiritual music was very important in the early days of recording. Gospel, hymns, songs that connected people to something larger than themselves. But they did it through beauty, not preaching." He played a song from 1918, a spiritual that had been recorded by some of the first great singers. In Tiny Tim's interpretation, the song became a prayer, a meditation, a conversation with the infinite. George listened with growing excitement, hearing possibilities he had never imagined. By evening, Abbey Road Studio 2 had been transformed into something unprecedented. The Beatles and Tiny Tim were collaborating on music that defied categorization. It wasn't rock, it wasn't traditional pop, it wasn't vintage revival. It was something entirely new, a fusion of past and future that created its own space in musical history. George Martin was documenting everything, knowing that these recordings would influence musicians for decades to come. "We need to capture this properly," he announced. "This isn't just a session, this is a discovery." Tiny Tim looked around the room with wonder. "I never dreamed I would be part of something so important," he said with characteristic humility. The final song they worked on together was a collaborative composition. Paul provided the basic melody. John added lyrics. George created guitar arrangements that bridged classical and rock. Ringo developed rhythmic patterns that combined swing with contemporary energy, and Tiny Tim contributed vocal arrangements that turned the entire piece into something transcendent. The song they created wouldn't be released for 5 years, but elements of it would appear in dozens of Beatles compositions. The harmonic structures, the melodic approaches, the emotional authenticity that Tiny Tim had shown them became part of their musical DNA. "This is what we've been searching for," Paul said as they listened to the playback. "This is our true sound." As the session wound down, John looked at Tiny Tim with something approaching awe. "I owe you an apology," he said. "When you walked in here, I thought you were just another novelty act. But you've shown us something we never could have found on our own." Tiny Tim smiled with gentle grace. "Oh, Mr. Lennon, you already had everything you needed. I simply helped you remember it. Music is like love, you see. It's always been there, waiting for us to recognize it." George Martin, listening to this exchange, realized that what had happened in Studio 2 would change not just the Beatles' music, but the entire trajectory of popular music. Tiny Tim had shown them that innovation didn't require abandoning tradition. It required understanding tradition so deeply that you could transcend it. When Tiny Tim finally packed his ukulele, the Beatles stood around him like disciples around a teacher. "Will you come back?" George Harrison asked. "Anytime you need to remember where beauty comes from," Tiny Tim replied. "The old songs will always be there waiting to teach us." He bowed slightly to each of them, then to George Martin, then walked out of Abbey Road Studios and into the London night. None of them knew it at the time, but that single afternoon would influence every Beatles album that followed. The emotional authenticity, the melodic sophistication, the willingness to serve the song rather than forcing the song to serve them, all of these lessons would echo through their music for the rest of their careers. Years later, when musicians would ask Paul McCartney about the dramatic evolution in Beatles songwriting after 1964, he would smile and mention a magical afternoon when an unusual American musician taught them that the future of music lay not in abandoning the past, but in understanding it so completely that it became a launching pad to places no one had ever imagined.